All right, so yeah, welcome everybody to KWJS. This is our first KWJS of the year. What we try to do is have a meetup every third Wednesday of the month, usually lasting between 2 hours or less. But basically bring the community together, talk about some cool things, especially in the JavaScript world, or kind of whatever topics that come to mind. Sometimes we have some meetups talking about people's backgrounds, the careers that we're kind of into, pretty much giving some insight to the community and getting some conversations going and helping out where we can. So welcome if you're new. Also welcome if you're a returning member. We got some cool talks coming up this year. So again, just one quick thank you to our sponsors. So just making sure that we can share some great knowledge and insight for people that want to learn some more as well. Our first sponsor that we want to thank is Vehicle. So Vehicle is a great software consultancy. So basically what they, I work for Vehicle as well, and they give me the time to put together this meetup and kind of coordinate. Also looking for some great speakers. So Andrii is also a developer as Vehicle as well. So thanks so much. A message from them. They wanted to share with the community that they actually have open workshops for people to join. So what they do every single day is they want to teach people about mob programming and lots of different aspects in web development. So as you can see here, they have a website called, or if you go to growth.vehicle.com, you'll be able to take a look at what they have. And this is absolutely free. And these are developers that actually commit some of their time to be able to teach people and show them all the wondrous ways of web development and mob programming. So if you want to learn some more throughout other days of the week, they do this every single day, so you can visit them there. So thank you to Vehicle. And our other sponsor, again, to thank you to JetBrains for giving us our monthly prizes that we can give out every single month at our meetups. All right, so that's enough from me. And what I'll do is I will pass it off to Lucas, and Lucas can give an introduction to our guest speaker tonight.
Great. Thanks, Margot. I'll keep it fairly brief, but Andrii presented, was it last January, Andrii?
I don't remember. It might have been like early 2022.
So it was a while ago anyway. You presented on using Postman against APIs, and I think specifically on the Postman API interface for it, which was fairly new to me at the time too. No, we talked a couple times one-on-one on that, but a good chat on that. And I think it's safe to say this is a form of continuation on that, maybe a little bit. Yeah, I don't want to give too much, but Swagger and OpenAPI are things that I think a lot of us have seen in varying capacities. Sometimes it's a very integral part of the stuff that we're doing, and sometimes it's an afterthought, and everything in between. But yeah, Andrii is going to be talking about how do we leverage some of that stuff for generating some service classes or service functions or whatever we want to call them for our front-end projects, and I suppose back-end projects too, proxy. But yeah, that's all I got for intro. Always great to hear Andrii speak. And Andrii, if you're good, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Hi everyone. Let me share my screen and I'll jump into it. All right, you should be able to see the presentation here. Hope you do. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Andrii. I'm a developer at Vehicle, and yeah, today I'm going to be talking about how to remove some of the pain points that you might have while writing some API services on your front-end code. This is going to be basically like, yeah, not a very formal talk. I'll be switching between the presentation and codes. I have some code examples that I want to share. And yeah, today what I hope we'll be doing is building a certain front end, which will talk to our backend, and we'll see the development in our front end from like the very basic solution into some more complicated ones up to actual like code generation, how you can optimize your flow when you're writing your API requests. So here are like the basic requirements for the front end that I'm going to be showing. It should be able to fetch data from the backend. It should be able to post data to the backend. And I'm ignoring like update and delete requests because those are pretty similar. So we'll just focus on like get and post requests today. And it should also be able to handle loading and error states. If your request failed, the UI should respond appropriately. If your request is taking a long time to load, the user should not be in a state waiting until something happens, right? Like the UI should relay some feedback to the end user. Okay, let me actually switch to some code here, and I'll show you what the setup is and what kind of we will be working with here. So I have two projects open. I have the backend project, which is a .NET backend. We won't be looking at this too much. Just for your information, this is written in .NET, and it uses the Open API spec, and I'll talk what that means about what that means a bit later. We also have our React frontend that talks to this backend, and all we want to focus on today is this app TSX component. That's what's going to be rendering all of the data from the backend. Now we have this nice Swagger UI that we get for our backend. The backend is just a simple to-do app backend that works with to-do lists and to-do items. That's all it has. It's fairly simple. I'm actually not even going to touch on to-do items. We will just be adding different to-do lists and listing them on the page. That's all our frontend will do. So I'll talk a bit about how you get this page. This is called Swagger UI. If your backend is using the Open API specification, you should be able to configure your backend to kind of render this page. It's a nice way to explore your API. You can see that for each controller that I have on my backend, I see all of the endpoints. I see different things I can do with my API. And for example, here I have a GET request to get all to-do lists. And if I execute this request, you'll see that it returns me some data here. There are some priority levels, and then there are lists, which I have only one right now, and it has some items in here. And this is all great, but we all actually want to use this in a front-end app. And the front-end app that I like, a boilerplate that I have built out is the following React app. So it just shows the to-do lists in kind of a list fashion, and it also has an input and a button to add a new list. So yeah, as far as like the setting goes, I tried to keep it very simple. Get requests to get all the to-do lists, and a post request to create a new list. So I'll kind of, it's going to be a lot of code here, and if people having questions, you haven't seen React before, or you're not sure of some concepts that I'm going to talk about, feel free to post questions in the chat. I'm kind of having assumptions that people have seen some of this, and I'm not going to go into like much detail how this works, but if you do have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. I'm going to answer anything I can. All right, let's see how this like initial solution works. Actually, I guess I'll demo this first. So if you reload the page, and I specifically have this throttled on the fast3G, so we have kind of like a slower request going on, because the requests are happening instantaneous, because this is running on one machine, not a lot of data coming through, so you might not see those like loading states, right? That would be a great thing if I could have shared the codes, but I did not upload this to GitHub. I might, yeah, I don't think that's going to work this way, unfortunately. I might upload this code so you can explore it after the session. But again, if you have, I know it might be difficult, but if you have any questions of what I'm showing, feel free to speak up and we can explore something in more depth. Okay, so yeah, we have this page that renders the to-do lists, and then we can just like add a new list. Here it appears. And right now, this doesn't even have anything about loading or error states. If I create a list without a name, this is actually an error that I catch from the backend. So you'll see that the request fails with a 400, but my UI does not show me anything. So this is a very simple solution where I'm just rendering a list of items and no loading state, no nothing. So let's dive into the code and see how this is done. This app component is fairly simple. So I'll start with the markup. That's what you see on the screen. We have some sort of lists variable that we map over, and that produces your like p tag of all the lists that we render on the page. You also have the input and the button to click, and that's pretty much it. What is meant by loading state? I will show an example with loading state, and it'll become obvious what that means. I think the next iteration of this will include the loading state, maybe the iteration after it, but it will become obvious what I mean by that. For now, we have a state for basically like the lists that we're rendering at the top, and also the new list title that we're typing in the input. This use effect with no parameters means that this will run when the page loads initially, and when it initially loads, we get the to-do lists, and we set the lists to what we get. This is all implemented manually, so the get to-do lists function is just a simple fetch to the URL. We're waiting until this completes, grabbing the JSON, and returning the lists. So again, this is not even using any external packages or anything fetches built in. Like this is if I were to write a simple initial solution for the requirements that I posted, that would probably be it. So initially, we just fetch the list of to-do lists, and this handle add list function will be called when the button is clicked. So on click, we have handle add list. It adds the to-do list, and it refetches the lists. So post, and then refetch the new state from the backend, so we get the updated view. And then again, add to-do list is a fairly simple fetch that has the post methods, content type, location JSON. This was my first experience with fetch. I've always used Axios for like sending requests, and it was kind of verbose to see how it's done with fetch. But you need to specify your post method. You need to specify your headers, because by default they are not application JSON. And then the body goes into like another parameter. That's it. That's what the app is, and that's how it works.
Just wondering, when you're using fetch with TypeScript, do you get IntelliSense for content type?
You mean like for this?
Yeah, like does your IG autocomplete?
Try it out. Nope, not for this.
Okay. That sounds good.
I needed to do this manually. I'm guessing. I mean, there is like some sort of a type on headers. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like that smart.
Okay. No, sounds good. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the question. All right. So, an important piece as well. I do need to define these interfaces. So the to-do items and the to-do lists are actually types that are defined on the backend. Those are basically like the data shape that my backend will send to my frontend. And I need to redefine these types on my frontend so I can work with it. Because I'm using TypeScript, I need some type safety, right? So these types need to be defined on my backend to send the data to my frontend, and they also need to be redefined on the frontend so I can work with them there. And this is kind of the duplication that we will see that we can optimize later on. Okay, does this look good for everyone so far? Do people have questions about what I've shown so far? Because this is like the starting point from where we will continue. It's fairly important that I don't lose too many people here. So yeah, if you are wondering about like how something works here, feel free to speak up or ask a question. So yeah, we're like on load of the page, we're getting all of the lists, rendering them in this JSX, a simple input and a button that does a post and refetches the list on the page. That's the starting point. All right, I'm gonna continue. Again, if you do have questions, please feel free to post them. The next iteration of this is introducing like this. Our component is pretty large, and it has a lot of responsibilities. It fetches some data. It has some state for like the new list style that we're adding. It holds all of the lists. It does a lot of things. So the natural step forward is to introduce some sort of an API service. So I'll check out the next step here, and let's see what happened here. We created this API service TS file, and it's just a pure extraction. What I did, I extracted the two interfaces into my API service, and I extracted the two functions that fetch data. So my API service is responsible for holding anything related to the backend, where I'm like fetching data. Here's my shape of what I'm getting, and my frontend can use these methods to perform queries. Nothing really changing on the app TSX side of things. Still like rendering this list of p tags and an input with a button. The only thing you'll see is that this became much smaller. We're only holding, still holding these two states for the overall like list of to-do lists and the new list title. And we're performing the same requests. On load, we're getting all to-do lists, setting them to the state, and when we click the button, we add the list, refetch, and all of that flow. All we did was just purely move these two functions into the API service, and have also two interfaces live here. All right. Now, somebody had a question about loading states and error states, and the next iteration of this is actually adding loading states and error states to this. So this is going to be the last point before I talk high level in my presentation, so bear with me. So there are dramatic changes to our fetch functions. Actually, now they are not fetch functions, they are custom hooks. If you've never seen how this is done, you can define your own hooks, similar to how useState or useEffect works. Now, our fetch functions became useGetToDoLists and useAddToDoList. What they are, they return the state of the request. Is the request in flight, meaning it's loading? Did the request fail, meaning we have some error state? Here's the data in case it succeeded. And we have an ability to refetch the requests for GET requests. Similar thing is returned by useAddToDoList custom hook here, where when we add the to-do list, we can ask questions about whether that process is loading, whether we have errors during that process, and we can actually like kick this off because you don't want that to happen on loads. You might want to have that happen on a click of a button. AppTSX changed quite a bit here. So here's how we use our custom hooks. We can say use get to-do lists and add the data as lists, add the loading state, the error state, and the refetch function. So whenever I will start using this, like just declaring it in my component, it will start fetching the data, and that's because the use effect with empty dependencies actually moved into this custom hook. So if we navigate here, you'll see that here's our use effects that used to live in our component. Now it lives in our custom use gets to-do lists hook. That will just, on initial render, on initial use of this hook, it will just get all the to-do lists and store them in state. This might be a complicated concept to grasp if this is your first time seeing custom hooks, because it's quite different, well, somewhat different from like how you would normally have state inside of the component. But if you grasp it, it's a very powerful concept, I think, and you might want to like leverage in when building React apps. I'll show how this is different from what we had before, because this does add some UI niceties to how our app looks. Then I'll explain a bit further in detail how this works. So first of all, and I'll make sure we're maybe even on slow 3G so this doesn't happen too fast. If I reload, this will take a while because this is slow. Maybe fast 3G was probably good. We'll get the loading state before we see the list of items. Think about like requests that will send thousands or like tens of thousands of items to your front end. Right now, we only send 2 to-do lists, but what if the list that we want to render is like huge, or it's very heavy on the network? This request will not complete in like 10 milliseconds. If you don't have a loading state for the request, your user will be just sitting in front of a blank list for a while, not knowing what's happening. A spinner, or in my case, just this loading label, notifies the user that, hey, we're waiting for something, like I'm doing stuff, bear with me, like I'm gonna load stuff soon, but it is taking a while, instead of your users being frustrated and not knowing what's going on. So loading states are pretty important. And the same actually occurs when I try to add a to-do item. So when I add a new list, we'll see a loading state because it's thinking, it's trying to add that to-do list. It's refetching. It's also going to do some processing, do some waiting, and then we'll see the new state of our list to get the items. So I hope the concept of loading and like the UI state for loading on requests is clear here. If the request takes a long time, we don't want to leave our user hanging with the state that does not represent reality. We want to show a spinner or a loading indicator while that's happening. This also handles error states. So if I try and submit a list that does not have anything, we will see an error saying that, hey, we failed to add a to-do list because now you can make this more sophisticated. You can actually render the actual error that your backend throws. Here I'm just like throwing in some text. But if you look into the request, and I'll make this a bit larger so you can see, the backend throwed us an error that the title already exists. I was actually expecting it would throw that it shouldn't be empty, but whatever. It failed for some reason that we supplied a wrong title here, and we got an error, and our UI responded correctly. Now, this is not like a very sophisticated UI that I've built here. Like usually you would either show a pop-up that would disappear, or you will still persist the list, but here I'm just rendering the error instead of the list for simplicity. So if I want to reload and try to get the lists again, I just need to reload the page. All right, let me have a look at the chat here. feel like you don't need to reload when adding an item. You have the data to create the item client side. Maybe if the server returns an error reloads, but generally you wouldn't need to. That's actually a very interesting approach, because so you could, I think there's like a term for this where you either show like something to do with like positive look ahead and like negative, like positive assumptions and negative assumptions. You're basically assuming that the data that you're submitting to the backend will succeed, and then you just show the data that you already you are sending to the backend, and then you're right. You don't need to get the data back. You're just saying like, hey, I have my new to-do list. I'm going to render it on the list. No loading states, no nothing, and I'm just going to fire off this request. And then only if it failed, I'll just like show an error response. And then there is the approach that I'm showing here is basically like a negative assumption that like, hey, I'm going to wait for my request until it succeeds, and basically only show the state on the backend. Like what I'm showing is exactly what is on the backend. So yeah, these are just two different approaches to how you render front-end states. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, optimistic updates. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Thank you, Lucas. All right, I'll keep moving forward. Yeah, we'll quickly talk about how like the loading and the error states work here. Essentially, it's pretty straightforward. You have your basically like the function that performs the fetch. It will try to do the fetch. This fetch is the same that was in the simple example. It will set the loading to true. If we succeed in fetching the result, we will set the data to what we fetched. In case we got any kind of error, we'll set the error to whatever we got. And finally, in any case, we should not be loading anymore. So set as loading is false. So yeah, this code is pretty difficult to read through and understand. We'll improve on this later on. But then the same kind of approach you see for the post hook as well. You have the loading and the error states. Set loading to true, perform the request. If it failed, we'll set the error state. If regardless of whether it failed or succeeded, we just set the loading to false. Yeah, okay. That's pretty much it. So that's kind of, we're not using any packages. We're not using anything external. This is like just sticks and dirt, I guess, like implementing the request to send to the backend. All right, here is where I come back to my presentation, and I'll have some diagrams to talk about. That's kind of the structure of how I see this like app working. We have our backend on the left, and we have our big front end that we'll be talking about. We have the UI and the API service, and they talk to each other. The API service has the fetch functions and the type definitions. In the latest examples, the fetch functions, they basically still exist. They just live inside the custom hooks. I didn't extract them. I just put them inside the hook itself. And then the hooks are what handle the loading and the error states. So yeah, your fetch functions talk to the backend directly. They basically like influence whether you have the loading or an error state, and that's related to the UI, and the UI is rendering different pages, different screens, depending on whether you have the loading or the error state. So right now, everything is our code. We wrote all of this. We didn't rely on any third-party packages or anything like that. That's both a plus and a minus, I guess, a pro and a con. We are managing everything we write. but we're also writing a lot of boilerplate code. So here are some drawbacks with what we have so far. A lot of boilerplate code implementing loading and error states. So you can see that this try, catch, finally kind of block is repeated in 2 places. And we're handling these states in our hooks repeatedly. The API service TS is quite large. Like imagine you have more, you're doing more requests. You will start splitting them per feature and having different services for different features and so on. And yeah, the main pain points is that you need to maintain a copy of each type from the backend. So I'm talking about these interfaces of like to-do items and to-do lists. They are already defined with your schema on the backend. But you're re-implementing these interfaces with TypeScript in your frontend. All right, let's see if we can do better. I'm going to check out another commit. And here where React Query comes in. So React Query is basically a package that allows you to remove the boilerplate code for all of the loading, error states, and any kind of refetch functions that you might to write. All you need to write for all you need to focus on is just fetching the request from the backend and responding to different states of that request. So let's see how that looks like. So first, I'll need to actually run yarn here because I'm adding a package. And I'll just start my front end back again. So actually, a few minutes before the talk, I realized that this commit is a bit broken, but I'll use this as an opportunity to explore what React Query offers and what we can do to improve this. So if we look at what changed here, our component didn't change much. Instead of our custom hooks, it's now using useQuery and useMutation, which come from React Query. This is something that React Query provides. These hooks take an ID that you need to supply, and they also take a fetch function. That's basically a concept in React Query. The fetch functions are exactly the same fetch functions that we've seen in the very first example. They still live in our API service, and all they do is fetch data from the backend. They use the fetch API, and they perform the requests here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Everything else is the same. If we're loading, we'll return the loading indicator. If we have some errors, we'll return the error. Handle add list is still there. So everything from like the component side of things is still the same, but our API service became much, much smaller. The only thing that we need to track is the interface and the fetchers. That's it. So this is the first step to having to write less code. The loading and the error states are handled by React Query. We still need to write the fetch functions. We still need to define the types that we're working with because React Query doesn't know what you have on the backend. You still need to redefine that on the front end. But you can see that there is some orange coming in already. Okay, I'll pause here. Are there any questions about what I've talked so far? I'm going to dive into what React Query is about and what options it has and things like that in the next few minutes. I'm also going to look at the chat a bit here. Definitely interested in discussing intentional UX decisions like the optimistic update discussion and some considerations on implementation. Yep, that'd be interesting too.
After the talk kind of comment.
Yeah. No, that was a very good comment. I think Paul was it? Yeah, I'm curious to like discuss pros and cons of each decision. All right, I'll keep going here. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them out loud, or just keep posting them in chat. That's also fine.
You're making perfect sense so far, Andrii, just for the
Yeah, I'm good. All right, that's good. At least one person understands me. That's good. Cool. Let's look at what we have here. And what problems I noticed when I was testing this before the talk, and maybe we can fix some of them here. So our page still reloads. We still see the loading indicator. But for some reason, and I couldn't figure out why, if I try to add like another list, it performs the request, but it doesn't reload the page. It doesn't show the loading states. It doesn't perform a reload for whatever reason. But in the requests here, you can see that it did perform a post. It did perform a get, as I asked my app. The funny thing is that as soon as I click this into focus, it will refetch. So that was like a very interesting behavior that I encountered. So it turns out React Query has a lot of different parameters. This is their use query hook that they have. This is all what it returns. And this is all of the options you can supply to it. So if we go back to our components, the only thing that I'm using so far is the data. What do I get out of my request? The loading state, the error state, and the refetch. So turns out that when you perform the refetch, that does not impact the isLoading parameter. IsLoading is only for the initial loading of your request. There is a second parameter called isFetching. And if we get that state out of use query, we can use that to render our loading state. So now this is going to be very minor, but bear with me. If I say that this is refetching and lists refetching, I'm adding like a new piece of state I can respond to. And I add this to my loading statement here. We'll see that everything is broken. Let's see. This is rendering quite slow, so I expect it to like lose CSS and things like that. Actually, I might want to put it on fast 3G so it's a bit faster. All right, so if I try and add an item, you'll see that there is now a loading state, and that's because it performs the refetch. We didn't have that state before because we were only responding to isLoading, but as I mentioned, isLoading in React Query, for whatever reason, they have two different states for that, where the loading is performed. You're exactly right. The second problem with this is that we don't see the new list. I mean, this was hard to see here, but let's add something obvious. You'll notice that the VBB is not there. That's another issue I was kind of debugging, and I'm like curious. Maybe we can look into it if we have time at the end of the session. But there are like more parameters that I must be missing with use query. But again, if we do a full reload and we look at all of the lists, the new item will be there. It just is not refetched for some reason, although the request is being performed. So yeah, I mean, apologies, this is like semi-broken, but I just want to share like basically the concept of how this should look like. The exact implementation, I think we can modify and talk about a bit later. All right, I'll talk about the pros and cons here. So what did we do? We made our API service much smaller. No boilerplate code. We are only as I mentioned, we're only storing the interfaces and the fetch functions. So no boilerplate code to handle the loading and the error state. That's all done by React query. Yeah, we removed this boilerplate code, but the drawbacks is still that we are copying the types from our front end to our backend. And the next approach will iterate over that. This is the last stop, I promise. No, this is the last piece. It will all come together. Okay, so I'll a few changes that I need to do here. First, I need to undo what I did with the refetch. I'll stop my front end and I'll check out this latest commit. And we are installing a new package. So I'm going to do a yarn. And another thing is that this new package, I don't know why I did this, but the backend URL that I'm storing in an environment variable for this new package, it's basically like, I think I copied the, oh, I know why, because it includes the /API in some part of the requests. So the URL for this new package needs to be just the pure localhost 5001. All right, we installed all of the packages, and I'll resolve all the errors, and I'll talk about what I did here. Maybe I'll do it again from scratch so it's clear. But the thing that we need to do right now is to generate some code. This approach is going to look at our spec and generate the API access code from the specification from the backend. So I'll run this yarn command that I defined. Typed correctly. This will generate some classes here that should hopefully resolve the errors that I have in my component. All right, let's have a look at what's happening here. So actually, before I dive into this, I see that there is some discussion. I'll probably give this a few minutes. Where do you update the list of to-do lists? Yeah. Isn't the data part of React query meant to be reactive? Yeah, that's totally possible. I might have missed that. Refresh happens or when loading finishes, when data updates. Yeah, let's probably talk about this after the session. Maybe you will actually like drive me and point me to what I missed. I'd be curious what things were wrong with that implementation. But yeah, it might be something that is mentioned in the chat. I'm open to any suggestions, but I'll keep going here and then we can maybe discuss this afterwards. All right. So with this approach, again, the component looks exactly the same. We have these two hooks. I'll explain where they come from a bit later. They perform the GET request and the POST request. They give us different states we can respond to. And again, we're just storing the state for the new list title. Handle@list is still there. We're responding to the loading states. We're responding to the error states. And the markup is exactly the same. The only real difference is that you'll see that instead of the API service, the API service is gone. There's no API service anymore. We have this open API folder. And that's where all of the code generation happens. So you notice that I run this yarn swagger gen command when I checked out the commit. So what did that actually do? Turns out that your open API, the OpenAPI folder contains the specification JSON file. And what is this? This is the OpenAPI specification that you can extract from your backend. I think last time I talked about this, I kind of showed how this is done on like an example of a JavaScript backend where you can like generate this out of different endpoints and different types that you have. But essentially, all of this spec came from my backend. So if I switch to my backend project, I have a similar specification JSON file that gets generated. And this includes the information about all queries, like all endpoints I have, the shapes of the requests, as well as, yeah, basically like the schema for the interfaces that the API uses. This file is exactly what drives the Swagger UI. Like the UI that you see here rendered is solely rendered from that one file. This page only knows what to render because this file includes information about different requests. Like if you look inside of here, you'll see that there is different requests that we're hitting. For example, API to-do lists, get, that's the one we're hitting to get the to-do lists. And there is a definition of like, what is the response schema? Hey, it's a to-dos VM. Like, yeah, like what are you expecting I'm expecting an application JSON with this exact shape. So this file exactly defines what our backend expects. And this is useful because we can use this on our front end to generate some codes that we don't need to write by hand. What this command does, it grabs this file, the specification JSON file, and it generates a few other ones. The two main ones and like the biggest ones are the to-do components and the to-do schemas. The to-do schemas contain different types that your API will work with. These are the shapes of the requests that you will send to the backend, and those are the shapes of the responses that you will get back. For example, let's scroll down here. Here's my to-do list DTO. This is if I were to create a new to-do list, this would be the shape that I would send. Actually, it might be create to-do list command now that I think about it. Yeah, because we're only sending the title. So again, this defined TypeScript types for you. I didn't write any of this. This was generated. In fact, you can see that the file is actually not in source control. All right, and the second file that it gets generated are these to-do components. It's much larger, but what this does is it generates a bunch of boilerplate code that is very hard to read, but this is a wrapper around use query, which will generate your hooks for you. So out of the different actions that you might perform with your backend, getting things, posting things, updating things, it will generate the hooks that you can use. And actually, the hooks that we see in our component here, the use to-do lists get and use to-do lists create, they come exactly from this file. Here you see that this hook is defined as some sort of function that uses the to-do context, performs the already known to us React query use query request. And it also uses fetch to-do lists get as our fetcher function. It automatically knows which endpoints to post to. And again, I didn't write any of this by hand. Now, what is to-do context and the fetch function? These are actually the other two files that we have here, and they are not out of source control because these files are actually not generated. These are defined by you, the developer, and yeah, I guess I'll talk a bit about each here. So the fetcher defines the generic fetcher function that will be used to perform requests. It has a lot of boilerplate code that was generated for me initially, but I can change any of this. If I want this to use Axios instead of fetch, I can change this to perform the requests differently. If I want to handle errors in some sort of different way, I can override how it handles errors. So this is all the default code that came with the package. The to-do context is similar. It's basically the context in which the fetcher will be called. You might want to use this, for example, for authentication. Let's say you are storing your auth key somewhere and you want to like retrieve it for every request. That this would be the place to do it. In fact, I think there might be like a header or something along those lines, which you can define and customize this. So these two files are the mechanism of how the request is performed. You can override them to your liking, but they are checked into source control. And again, this code was generated, but it can be customized. The other two files are completely driven by your schema and your specification. All right. So what does that look like on our diagram? We completely went orange. So all of our code that is responsible for fetching data from the backend is not code that we write. We don't need to even care about this anymore. React Query does the job of basically like handling the loading in the error states. The fetch functions and the type definitions are all generated from our specification with the OpenAPI CodeGen package. And there's no API services. There's no files you need to maintain. So this piece of code talks to the backend. And in our UI, all we need to do is literally just use these hooks here. You might need to do some configuration. You might need to do some customization with these context and fetchers. But for the most part, all of the code is generated for you. I'll demonstrate how the code generation happens once again, by the way, just so it's clear. So I'll actually delete the to-do components and the to-do schemas. I'll leave to-do, context, and fetcher here. And I'll just demonstrate that this happens essentially, like not triggering you. You can see that those two files are just completely generated from the spec file. If I were to remove the spec file, I think this command will fail, saying that like, hey, I don't know what are you talking about. There is a very nice article describing how this is all set up, because there is some like initial setup steps that you need to perform to basically tie in React Query and generate the initial setup with this context and the fetcher. They are fairly simple, but I'll share the article in the presentation, and I'll share the presentation notes in the chat for anyone who's curious. Let's see.
Andrei, sorry,
Yep.
I have a question.
Go
Can
ahead.
you open again the to-do schemas, please?
For sure.
Well, one thing that I've noticed is that, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but every single property seems to be an optional property. Is this because the generator prefers to err towards making properties that are not optional being optional, or is this the schema of this project really has all the properties being optional?
That's a good question. I think this is because when you're sending the request, you can truly omit different properties. Like, it might actually be because I'm using C# as my backend. When you're creating objects in C#, let's say your object has 3 properties. You could as easily create that object with 2 properties and omit one of them. So it's not like those properties are required. There might be some way in where you would say that like some property is not explicitly like not nullable, and then the generated schema will not have that optional.
Right.
I think just by the virtue of me using C# as my backend, that's why I get all of these optional.
I see. Okay, thank you so much.
Paul says that I doubt you can mark the field as mandatory in the JSON spec. Yeah, let's look at the JSON spec for sure. If I only, let's look at it through the backend. So we are looking at, I'm guessing we're looking at like the request shape or the response shape. So for example, yeah, here, for example, you have the title nullable true, and I'm guessing, I wonder if I have like nullable false for any of them here. Yeah, there's no nullable false.
Okay.
Right. So everything is true for what you know.
If you just toggle that in regen, it should actually give you a non-optional.
Let's try it. Yeah, sure.
Right?
Live demo. Let's go. Okay, let's do the to-do item. Actually, I'm gonna just copy this over because I deleted the file. I guess I can just undo this here.
Because technically speaking, I think you could have a thing that is nullable but is required. You know what I mean? So I want to see that test, but I'm assuming we'll probably need to pass another key of like required equals true or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do. What are we changing here? Let's change something obvious. Create to do item command. We'll change this to false. Save this and regen. And we'll go to our schemas. No, yeah, this is still optional. It might be.
Yeah, I think it's required true. Can you try that? I think it's like under type or something like that. Oh, title. Yeah, perfect. Try that. Because this is an open API specification in JSON, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's try this out. Okay, I'm just going to copy this. Yeah, it might actually, might be something else, might not be handled.
Right.
But that's a fair point. This is kind of nearing the end of the presentation. I'm just going to quickly go through the last slides, and then we can try different things people find interesting if we have enough time. So in terms of improvements of the last solution, we got rid of the API service, and all of the types are now generated from the OpenAPI schema. So yeah, those are kind of the improvements that we had. And in terms of resources, I just linked all of the packages that I used in my solution. And this one alternative package is another generator package for OpenAPI spec. I have seen this used by another team here at Vehicle, and I just wanted to post this as an alternative. This is a much more mature package, but it does not generate the hooks as well as the OpenAPI CodeGen does. So OpenAPI CodeGen, although I'm like referencing this is a pretty new package, which will have things like what Philippe just mentioned, potentially not implemented or not supported. But I thought the concept was really cool, and we are using this for our code base, and we keep looking for these kinds of things and improving the package. But I just want to pose this warning. This versus this might not be as complete as you hope, but it's much more mature, as opposed to this is a much more interesting concept, but it's pretty new and might lack some features. And then finally, there is the article to set up the OpenAPI CodeGen. The documentation on this is fairly poor, and actually I have a pull request on their repo to improve the docs for the package, but I post this article, and this article does do a good job in terms of explaining how to set up the package. All right, yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything I wanted to share. And yeah, I'm open to trying different things, poking around and seeing how this responds. Or if people have general questions, feel free to ask them, and we can have some side discussions. And good to do that as well.
For what it's worth, I'd be curious to see if we can figure out that re-render issue. What's actually going on there for it, but that might be a post raffle style thing, maybe. I don't know.
Sounds good.
I just want to say, I think it's pretty cool that with this thing that you showed us, you can have one source of truth for what is the shape of the data, and that source of truth can be what you use for the documentation. It's kind of like it's the best source of truth that you can have, in my opinion.
Exactly. And I haven't done it this way, but I know that you can go spec first. You can literally start with your spec, writing the specification JSON by hand, and generating your backend code from it, and now generating your frontend code from it. So that'd be a interesting thing to try, or like in a project, right?
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
But yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Andrii, did you ever try the just the official Open API package for generation?
I haven't, and I'd be curious to look at it, and maybe that's like another resource we can post. That's the one I found, but I think this one, I'm not sure what the official Open API one does. Maybe does that work with React and like React hooks, or?
I don't know. I was just looking to see if there was
Right.
a kind of official one, and it looks like Open API/Open API repo on GitHub is a thing, and it says for generating JavaScript and TypeScript.
All right. Well, yeah, maybe actually I wouldn't be surprised if this is the official. This one in particular caught my eye because it does generate hooks for you, and like it does all the job for you, because if you only get like type generation or schema generation, you still need to write your use query hooks kind of by hand. This genuinely gives you like hooks to use in your code. So that was an interesting way of like wrapping React query. But yeah, definitely, I think those are worth exploring, and maybe that's another KWJS. Yeah.
I think I'll be the one to talk for a second, at least. That I think that's always a bit of a struggle in how do you let things that you control dictate your types on your project rather than something that you don't control. And if this is a project that you're writing the front end and the back end, then I really wouldn't have any concern, I don't think, with using the Swagger or the Open API docs to define the shape of your components.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're a separate team or a separate company or an open service that you're using for something, that's the case where I would actually probably still define the types on my component and then leverage them. And that's one of the nice things about TypeScript. It's just shape based, right? So you don't actually have to do an explicit extension of or implementation of an interface to actually make it work, which you would have to do with other languages. So it's kind of an interesting concept, I think, to say, here's my to-do list and here's my to-do item components, and let's define the props for them. And then let's have services that return those types without being explicitly bound to them. Giving up control is always a tricky thing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I found this concept very interesting. That like you have one source of truth for both things. And in fact, one thing that I've seen that is available in this example here, we're generating our code out of the file. There is an alternative way you can set this up where it would just literally look at the URL where the specification is hosted, and you could query that URL, the current state of the backend, and update the hooks. I'm still kind of thinking about the use case for that, because in my mind, I would probably want it like manual, but I know that's possible. So if this is something you want to go for, then yeah, generating out of a URL is dynamically is another way. Let me look through the chat here. Is there a way to generate enums or unions for lookup values? All right, enums is a good question. I feel like enums should be handled. So like if I define an enum on the backend, it will be generated to a TypeScript alternative. Not sure what you mean by unions for lookup values. Yeah, but enums should be handled, yeah. All right, Felipe has some suggestions. Felipe, do you want to try stuff, or should we do the raffle first and then we'll try different things?
No, yeah, and I think we tried that, so that's,
yeah?
that's what I'm curious. Like we tried the required true, right?
I wouldn't be surprised if it just like gives you the option to not provide different things, and then you would just, yeah, you would. I guess you would like just have errors from your backends if those things are required.
Right.
So actually, I wonder if we tried the required param in the right place. One interesting thing that I noticed, I think Joe posted this about GraphQL code gen and Vue. Yeah, I'd be curious how that looks like. I also wanted to quickly share. I'll share my screen here. So a cool thing about React Query is that I believe TanStack is like the company that develops the product. They have something called Vue Query. So it's exactly the same concept, but for Vue. And in fact, the OpenAPI code gen tool that we used for generating React hooks, I know that there are some issues open for supporting Vue Query. So you could also have the same thing going in Vue, where you just have your schema generate different hooks and use them in Vue. So yeah, I just wanted to share that this there is some support for Vue and other front-end frameworks. All right, anything people want to try? Do we want to like dig into that? Oh yeah, go ahead, Drew.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Cool. So I recently had a situation where I was trying to actually work with data or work with the structure where the backend hasn't been done yet. So I was looking for a way to intercept calls, and I tried to use a package called Mirage. I wonder if anyone has attempted to use it with Vue or React to intercept GraphQL and successfully did it.
I haven't worked with Mirage or
Cool.
GraphQL extensively, but is the use case basically like your backend is not built out and you're trying to have some sort of a service that runs and mocks the backend?
Yeah, there's two. Yeah, that one's the main one that most people get it for. The second one's actually like, say you wanted to create a certain scenario to test something. You could intercept a very specific call. So you could say like, oh, I'm trying to test my my to-do feature, and I get all my users and I get everything, but I want my list to return empty, and I don't want to have to create that scenario. So you would just kind of turn Mirage on, and you'd be like, oh, this team list is now going to return empty, the way you know your backend would return if it was actually empty. So you could just create these scenarios and intercept
Right.
specific calls and bypass other ones, and pretty useful. But I couldn't get it to go. I wondered if anyone had experience with it.
I don't know Mirage, but I do know that Postman does something similar, where they have. Let me open up Postman. This might be not. Yeah, let's. I don't know if I'll be able to show this, but basically they have something similar where you can set up your API for like basically like create your API out of the spec, let's say, or like create some endpoints, and then have mock version of that run on an actual URL your frontend can work with, and then you can also simulate different requests and literally even like maybe write some mock backend code to respond with different statuses or different responses depending on what the request is. So I know that that's
Interesting.
doable,
Okay.
but I don't know if that will work with like your. It's not in the same code base, right? Like it's a third-party application that runs on your machine, but I know it's possible through Postman as well.
Yeah, I wonder if it's the same thing when it comes to GraphQL, because usually with GraphQL, your endpoint is you're like, it's always the same thing, right? It's just you're always sending a post. It's just the data that you're changing is different. So I wonder how Postman would handle that. I think that's part of the reason I had issues with
Right.
Mirage too.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that would work with GraphQL, but yeah.
Something to try. Cool, thanks.
Joe, I did follow up a little bit after you and I chatted about this, I think last week, that there is documentation on the MSW documentation like site for mocking GraphQL APIs.
Yeah, I think I went a little bit there too. There's some documentation in the Mirage one, and it shows like alternatives to itself, and MSW is one of them, and it actually uses something called Pretender, and that was another alternative, and there's some other stuff out there too that other people make. So I'll give other things a shot. I just I was trying to get that one to go really bad. Didn't work. All right, cool.
Cooler
Let's
name.
move on for this.
Cool. Thanks, Joe. All right. Did we try and fix my React query stuff, or maybe that's the last thing we do and then we'll wrap this up? So I heard some suggestions of what we can do there. I'd be curious to try some of them. So let's remove all of this stuff. And I'm just gonna reinstall. Okay, so back to the use query and use mutation example. Let's see. So the main problem was with the refetch.
You probably don't need slow 3G for this if you wanted to switch it back.
Let's probably do that shortly. Oh, and I also need to update my env because I forgot about it. All right, so whenever I create a new thing, request happens, you can see that the post and the get happened, so the refetch happened. The list does not update. As soon as I click into the view, because React query set up this way, I do get, actually, I do get the new item. So we can try and debug this a bit, and if people have things they want to try or directions to go, I'd be curious to try different things.
I think the answer is going to be yes, but I'd be curious to see that object is actually in the get request that happens right after, just to be sure that it's in there and that's not the issue. I assume you don't have any async jobs doing the writing or anything like that. But.
No. So that's basically what happens after you click the button.
Mm-hmm.
You await the addition and you await the refetch. One thing that I did notice when I did this was that I think, yeah, in add to-do list in the refetch function, I'm not awaiting the fetch call, which might be part of it, but I don't believe that fixed the issue. So let's see here. Actually, I'm gonna clear the list of items because this is getting a bit too crowded.
I'm putting money on it. That was the issue.
All right, let's see. Here you go. All right, whatever. Maybe I forgot about really? Like,
was that it? Well, if your server is processing both requests simultaneously or near simultaneously, and the write is taking longer than the read, then it makes sense that you would actually get the response back from the read first before the database actually gets the update.
Makes sense.
Which is why I was wondering whether or not the response of that get that got issued right before or right after actually had the item in it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it probably wouldn't have.
All right. Well, that's stupid. Okay. Well, in that case, a thing I'm curious about is like another issue that I noticed with this, and maybe that's actually fixed with the is refetching thing that I demoed. But essentially, if I'm gonna do this on slow 3G, if I add the item, will load, it will show the previous state, and then it will show the item. So it will not show the refetch. And I think that's fixed with the is refetching parameter. If I do is refetching, like refetching lists, then I wait on that. Wait, did I? Oh. Let's see. So if I add this, yeah, the loading is longer and we see the good. Yeah, okay. So those were the two issues, right? Like we're not waiting on the is refetching. That's a separate state in React query, and I just missed an await. So that was that.
I was curious if because I'm. Go ahead, Joe. Go for
it. Are you sure? You're like already halfway into it. Go. I was just actually curious to is it I don't know about this, but like I feel like it's common practice, or is it a standard to have your ad return a result other than just success, like usually have it return like the updated list? Is that normal?
I find, actually, let's talk about this. I find that odd because like whenever I've seen this a lot, and maybe this is a standard that I miss, but unless I care about like the states of what or like the result of the create, I would just return nothing. I would just return void. Maybe I would return the ID of the created item potentially. If there is something on the UI that needs to happen after you create an item, maybe like you create an item and you need to straight away open that item, right? There might be some value of returning the ID of the newly created item. But I always found it odd when like
return the whole list, right?
Yeah, somebody writes the endpoints and then like does a separate query to like fetch the new state of the list, or like return the whole item with all the payloads. I don't know. I always find that odd. I'd be curious to hear if there are like counter arguments to what I think.
I see someone, I guess they could return the item like you just said that just got created and then used it to update the cache. So you could have, like, let's say you said add, and then you optimistically add it to the cache. And then if the add was successful, you could use the ID to update the new item in the cache. But you'd have to identify the new item by something. Yeah, it's interesting. Cool.
But like, yeah, I'm still not sure why would you return like the whole payload out of your post request, right? The ID should be enough. Yep.
Yeah, I would think the whole list, if that's what you're talking about, would be a very, very weird optimization, which would make the API unintuitive. But I mean, maybe the optimization makes sense. Yeah, I guess my thought on the whole thing is then you're really tempting CQRS violations on things as soon as you start returning payloads from created items and updated items and stuff. Updates are maybe a little bit different, but I love the 201 created things because then you're not tempted to use it. Because I mean, I don't know. It's a subjective thing, I know.
Yeah, keep it simple.
So the thing that I was going to ask was, have you played around with invalidate queries? Because I was talking to actually Tuan about this the other day, and I didn't know how you do it, but I figured it was a thing.
What is this?
So invalidate queries, like when you perform a mutation, when you finish with that mutation, you can actually run an invalidate queries against the client object, and that will say anything that matches that invalidated query will have to refetch itself. So that way, if you wanted to say everything that has to-dos or to-do items or something like that in that is now going to be invalid because we just replaced it or we just updated that list, it will cause it to refetch without you having to go explicitly like write that glue code to tell it to update things.
Interesting.
So I haven't played with it yet, but
would that like replace it with the new state that we get from the backend, or is it just literally like from the UI list, remove the item that got updated?
Well, no, like if you had like, because you've got get all lists or something like that for your get query, right? And then you've got your add list or whatever variation of it. You've got your initial get request to get the list, and then you got your add to it. And what you would do is whenever you did an add, at the end of the add, you would say, okay, now I want to invalidate my previous query that fetched that list of everything. And as soon as that's invalidated, then I think React Query will say, hey, I don't have valid data anymore. I have to refetch myself.
Oh.
And then cause it to go. So it's kind of a declarative reactive kind of thing that you do where you just say, I guess it's like dispatching an event saying your data is no good anymore. And then it will go do what it needs to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of like calling explicitly the refetch, you would just say like, hey, my previous fetch was not valid, like go and do it yourself. I wonder if React Query has anything in here.
That is from React Query. I just posted the link.
I mean or maybe it would be use mutate in that case, right? Because we're dealing with we would be dealing with a GET request. So yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't messed around with this too much. But that's an interesting approach to how you do it.
I wonder, do you think the benefit there with the invalidate thing is that you're not just running a refetch in your current component, but invalidating it would like tell all the other components too, because it would know that this query got called with these filters. So this is the same one, invalidate all across the app.
Yeah, so it's basically observer pattern would kind of kick in at that point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you could also you can either do this through React Query, or you can do this manually by having some sort of like context that's shared between your different UI elements that perform the same request, and then like issue an update. If I'm doing it manually, that's what I would do.
The instance method for it is actually on the query client, and I think you have to have your React query inside of a context that hosts the client anyway, right? So then I think everything is cached against that client instance.
Are you talking about this?
Yes. Yeah. So your query client right now is the thing that holds on to all those cache keys, I think. So
Right.
when you run your invalidate on that, it will cause anything that's using that same client to re-render. I think.
And then you have like multiple clients for probably like different groupings of
If you
queries.
needed to. Yeah. Yeah, I think you'd use the different query keys as kind of the main way to do it, but yeah, you could do different clients too.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case. Cool. I don't know. Anything else people want to try or poke around, or questions people have? Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up.
Okay, I'll jump in with thank you, Andrii. Thank you
Oh,
for
yeah.
presenting tonight.
I'm
Really appreciate it.
I'm always open to like throwing to like what I know at the general public, and people probably come out with either learning something or teaching me how to do it better. So in both ways, it's a win-win, and I appreciate everyone who is like posting questions or any criticisms or like alternative solutions to what I'm doing. I'm always curious to seeing how other people do it. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like this way I'm learning a lot. If I'm presenting something and I'm throwing it like, hey, this is a way I'm doing things, and this is a cool way I've learned. Can you do it better? Maybe I'm missing something, and yeah, I appreciate everyone contributing to the discussion.
That's right. And you know what, Joe, we can definitely do that next time. We don't want to get burnt out this time, that's for sure. It's all about balance. But yes, thank you so much, Andrii, for this amazing talk. I hope everyone had a great time learning here. That's what the community is all about. So thanks, Andrii. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. All right. I'll just say thanks for coming, everybody, and have a great night. And we'll see you at our next KWJS. Hopefully it'll be then next month, the third Wednesday of the month.
Mm-hmm. As a preview, I don't know if this will happen or not, but it does play into what Joe was talking about. I'm very curious to do something on MSW and maybe tie that into a couple different things. So MSW is for things like hosting an API that's maybe not complete, or being able to have a local implementation that doesn't require API hits on an external service or something along those lines. And I think we're generally hitting those whenever we're doing JavaScript front-end code. I know there's back-end developers here too in some cases, but yeah, it'd be, I think, really interesting to dig in. So either myself, or I might ping somebody else from Vehicle or elsewhere if anyone has any thoughts and experience.
All right. Until next time, have a great night, everybody.
Cool. Bye-bye.